Welcome to part 8 of the New South and the Wild West. Now we're going to take a look at ranching and cowboys. When we think about Western ranching, we have the tendency to think about open range ranching, right? The more romantic of the two, anyways. You know, the wide open ranges and the cattle graze, and then the famous cattle drives, of course, driven by these heroic cowboys and all that. And we really kind of create this image in our heads that's larger than life, right? And there's a couple things that we need to remember about this when we think about it is that, first of all, the cattle drives in the American West were really pretty short-lived. Cattle drives in the West only really went between 1866 and 1884. Now, in that time period, Texas is going to drive over 5 million cattle to the different slaughterhouses in the north. And it was necessary, right? Because you needed to slaughter the cattle as near as you could to your market. But at the same time, there was a lot of things that made it more difficult for that to happen. For example, as people began to settle in these regions, the last thing they wanted, if you're settling off on your 160 acres and planning on farming it, is to have a bunch of cattle tromping through your farm. So what do? You start putting up fences, right? What do they say? Good fences make good neighbors, right? You know, sometimes some people say that barbed wire tamed the Wild West. Now, of course, I make the assertion that the West never really was that wild, but barbed wire definitely did take the cattle drive out of the picture, right? So another issue with that too is what happened after you drove the cattle. Let's say you're driving cattle from here in Texas and you drive it all the way to Abilene, or let's say maybe you go a little farther, you go all the way to Chicago. What condition do you think those cattle are going to be in by the time they get there? I mean, they've just walked literally 1,000 miles. They're going to be pretty worn out, right? Worn thin, if you will. And cattle are sold by the pound. You know, meat is still sold by the pound. So a lot of less scrupulous cattlemen, what they would do is they'd drive their cattle, and then afterwards they would find some watering hole and leave them there for about 2 weeks, right? Cattle aren't exactly brilliant animals, right? That's why you're never going to see them on Jeopardy for more than reasons than just that. But so if a cow is sitting around a watering hole just bored, it's going to drink. It's going to start retaining water. This is a tactic called watered cattle, right? So you let your cattle sit there and drink a whole bunch of water and then get really kind of bloated and from retaining water. Now you drive them the rest of the way to market. You sell them there by the pound. The guy buying the cattle for the slaughterhouse is going, whoo, these are nice looking cattle. And then he literally watches these cows pee their profit away, right? Matter of fact, in Texas, watered cattle will actually be an executable offense if you're caught doing it, right? But like I said, when the West gets kind of more and more closed up and it's harder and harder to do these drives and railroads start making them unnecessary, you start to see a different form of ranching take place. Something that was already dominant in California where cattle drives weren't even really an option. And that was haymaking, right? You have your cattle on a relatively small portion of your land and you use the rest of that land to grow feed for that cattle. And that's still pretty much what we do today, right? We make feed for the cattle and the cattle are relegated to a small area, right? Now, thanks to refrigeration and railroads and transportation systems, now we can have slaughterhouses not too far from where the cattle are ranched. That's why like Fort Worth is literally a hub for ranching, right? But at any rate, the haymaking model made the more romantic open range model go away entirely. And where does all this leave the cowboy? I mean, if there's something that gets romanticized more in the West than the cowboy, I don't know what it is, right? The thing is that the reality of the cowboy does not match its romantic personification. First of all, cowboys date way back. Matter of fact, the Spanish were the first ranchers, right? And the vaqueros were the first cowboys. And some of the romanticism that surrounds the cowboys can actually be traced back to some of the things that the vaqueros did. The vaqueros would like to put on displays of their skill in ranching, right? Rodeos. But the rodeos, these were things like showing off rope skills and things like that. It's not like what you see now, right? Vaqueros would show off their abilities to round things, branding cattle, driving cattle around. The rodeo today looks nothing like that, right? The rodeo today is all surrounding things like bull riding and bulldogging, okay? The thing you have to realize about these cowboys at the end of the day is just like the miners, they're wage laborers. They're working for a pay, or they're working for a paycheck. That's it. Okay? They're not necessarily seeing anything that we romantic about it, not like we do today. And the things that we see in rodeo that kind of give it some more of that romantic personification would be ridiculous to the cowboys back then. Let's think about this for a minute. Bull riding. Somebody somewhere said, let's make this bull really mad and ride him and see if we can stay on it for 8 seconds, right? Do you think the cowboys in the middle of a cattle drive would do that? You're sitting there, you're driving a bunch of cattle from Texas, you're going through Indian territory, right? Oklahoma, on your way to Abilene. And somebody says, hey, why don't we hop on that bull and ride him? The guy next to him is going to say, are you crazy? That's stupid, because if you get hurt out here in the middle of nowhere, you just get to be dead. That is the end result. Just a lot of dead, because that's what you got to look forward to. Things like that aren't going to happen. In bulldogging? Well, first of all, bulldogging was created by a man named Wild Bill Pickett. He's from Tyler, Texas. He's an African-American, an exoduster, right? An African-American cowboy. 1/3 of the cowboys were African-American or Hispanic or Native American, right? He came up with this idea of bulldogging. Bulldogging is cattle wrestling, where you literally chase the cow on your horse, you dive off, grab the bull by the horns, wrestle him to the ground, tie his 3 legs. Very, very adventurous in appearance, and again, never would have been dreamt of by these cowboys, right? Dive off onto a cow with pointed horns in the middle of nowhere and wrestle him? Forget that. Follow him on the horse until the darn thing gets too tired and you can round him back up. So not very romantic. And the idea of cowboys and Indians, as we'll see moving forward, not really cowboys and Indians. Cowboys are wage laborers. They didn't want to fight with the Indians if they could help it. If we were going to have cowboys and Indian stories, we really should have made it federal troops and Indians, because that would have been a little bit more accurate.